We're going to start off with a review of our 17 time periods. I'm hoping that these are becoming a little bit more firmly planted in your mind, that you're able to call these to memory pretty quickly. So what's the first one? No, the first one is not a bunch of mumbling. What's the first one? All right, good. Okay, before the flood, and then obviously that's going to be followed by the flood, okay, and then the scattering of the people and the patriarchs. Now, the first four of them are covered in the book of Genesis, right? So we're in the period of the patriarchs right now. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, okay? Now, Joseph's life ends in the land of Egypt, so that should help us as we figure out what the next one is going to be. Exodus from Egypt, yeah, okay, good. All right, and after the people left Egypt, what did they do for 40 years? Yeah, they wandered in the wilderness, okay. Then they came into the land of Canaan, so we have the invasion and the conquest of the land of Canaan. And then after Joshua's time, the people are ruled by judges, okay. There's 15 of those. And in the time of Samuel, the 15th judge, the people said, give us a king. So we go into the United Kingdom. There's 3 kings in the United Kingdom. Saul, David, and Solomon. Then after the United Kingdom, of course, is the division of the kingdom. Okay, good. And then Israel in the north, what happens to them? Yeah, they go away, so we're just left with Judah down in the south. And then Judah goes into captivity, just like Israel did. Now, after a captivity that lasted how long? 70 years is what the prophets said would be the length of the captivity. So after that, what did the people do? Yeah, they returned from captivity. And so that closes out the Old Testament. After the Old Testament ends, we have the years of silence, all right, which of course are then followed by, the life of Christ. And then the people who were the followers of Christ, what are they called? All right, the early church. And all these people in the early church need teaching. And how was that teaching done? Through letters that was written to them by Paul and John and James and others. Okay, very good. All right, open your Bible to Genesis chapter 13. I know we've already covered that, but I want to remind you of something we read in Genesis 13. So we're making our way to Genesis 18 and 19 tonight, but let's start in 13 where Abram, as he is called at the time, and Lot have families and herds and flocks and servants and all of this. And what happens in Genesis 13, you remember? They have to separate from one another because they just have too much. The land is not enough to sustain them in the place where they are. They've got to split up. And remember in Genesis 13 and verse 12, Abram settled in the land of Canaan while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Or he pitched his tent toward Sodom, your translation might say. Now, we're given in verse 13 a little bit of a foreshadowing of what is coming. The men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked. Now, we're going to find that out tonight. Okay? So let's go to Genesis 18, where the destruction of Sodom is announced. Chapter 18 and verse 1. Now the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day. Now while Abraham, man, I can even say Abraham now, and I'm still saying Abram. Okay, while Abraham is sitting at the door of his tent, what does he see? He sees 3 strangers, one of whom is who, according to verse 1? One of them is God. Now, there's a lot of discussion about does Abraham know that or not? And some say, well, yeah, look at what he says. And that indicates maybe he does know that there's something special about one of these men. I'm not so sure what to make of that. It's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around some of this. But the text clearly says in verse 1 that the Lord appeared to him. And then in verse 22, you also see that Abraham, chapter 18, verse 22, the men, that's talking about the other two, turned away from there and went toward Sodom, while Abraham was still standing before the Lord. All right, so Abraham sees three men, one of whom the text clearly says is the Lord. Who are the other two? And how do you know that? All right, they're angels. How do we know that? Chapter 19, verse 1. Yes. 19 and 1 clearly says that these are angels. Okay, so God and two angels. Now, sometimes in Scripture, you'll see this expression. Now, the angel of the Lord appeared to such and such. The angel of the Lord. In fact, we've already seen that in some of our studies. Sometimes that's talking about, it seems, God himself. Sometimes it seems that it's not talking about God, but an angel who is representing the Lord. He came on behalf of the Lord. And it's kind of hard to know exactly which one it is. You have to let the context help you a little bit. But when this happens, when Abraham sees these three strangers, he's still 99 years old. Okay? So chapter 17 and verse 1 tells us that he was 99. And you remember in chapter 17, what did God say to Abraham about the birth of Isaac? Chronologically, what did he tell him? Do you remember when would it happen? Next year. God said specifically, a year from now, you will have a child. All right? Well, Isaac isn't born until chapter 21. So Abraham is still 99 in chapter 18. Follow me? All right. So Abraham is at the tent, at the door of his tent. I know I've said that 4 times already. I did that for a reason. How old was Abram when he left Ur of the Chaldeans? You remember? 75, chapter 12 and verse 4. So here we are now, almost 25 years later, and Abraham is still living in a tent. Even though the text of Scripture says that he settled in Hebron, he settled there in a tent. So look at Hebrews chapter 11. The Hebrew writer calls attention to this, okay? This is not just me pointing out what seems like an insignificant detail. Hebrews chapter 11 talks about the faith of Abraham. Hebrews 11 verse 8 is where the discussion of Abraham begins, that he obeyed when he went out to a place where he did not know where he was going. Verse 9, by faith he sojourned in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Abraham traveling in tents is a symbolic, the Hebrew writer says, of him looking for a place of permanence, a place that has foundations, which tents don't have. Abraham's looking for what the text later goes on to say in verse 16 is a heavenly country, a place that God has made for him. So I just think it's interesting that, if I had told Stacy that for 25 years we were going to live in a tent, I don't think that would have gone over very well. What do you think, Lita? Yeah, I don't think she can hear me. I don't think that would have gone over very well, right? But Sarah was okay with it. Now, Abraham receives these 3 men. And, of course, I'm back in Genesis 18 now. But he receives these men and he shows hospitality to them. He treats them very well. He feeds them and he washes their feet and gives them a break from the heat of the day, as it mentions in verse 1. And while they are there, what do they tell Abraham? What do they remind him of? Once again, yeah, that's right. They tell him again, you are going to have a son. You are going to have a child. Now, Sarah hears this discussion In verse 10, it mentions that she was nearby and she was listening. And what's her reaction when she hears them say, Sarah's going to have a child? Why is she laughing? How old is Sarah? Do you remember?
90.
She's 90 right now. Okay, I'm not going to call on any of you ladies in the audience, but some of you, if you were told you were going to have a baby at your age, you'd probably be laughing too. Okay? Sarah says, are you serious? Are you kidding me? It's a laughter of disbelief, really, of doubt. And she understands that biologically speaking, that's not supposed to happen. But the question of verse 14 is really important. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? God's going to make this happen, right? And that's what's so astonishing about this story. Yeah, Sarah's right. She's not supposed to be able to have a child at her age. Abraham is not supposed to be able to father a child at his age. But that's what makes the power of God so astonishing in this promise. All right. So now these men have come and they have been treated well by Abraham. And so now in verse 16, the men rose up from there. They looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Okay, I love this question that God asks. Can I hide what I'm about to do from Abraham? What do you sense in that question, if anything? Is there anything about that question that strikes you? Why does God feel compelled to tell Abraham his plans for Sodom? Joe? Nice and loud, Joe. Abraham's nephew lives in Sodom. Okay, so it sure would be kind of mean if I just destroy the city where his nephew lives and I don't give him a warning. Okay, I can see that. Anything else?
Verse 18, I think. Since Abraham shall become great and a mighty nation, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him.
Good.
Yes, that was the answer, I think.
Okay. Jerry says, verse 18 helps us. Abraham is to become the father of many people. And he's been telling Abraham time and time and again, through you, everybody's going to be blessed. Everybody's going to be blessed through you. You are going to have descendants. And now he's going to lead Abraham out and destroy entire cities and devastate peoples right in front of Abraham? Wait, I thought Abraham was going to be a source of blessing to people. Wouldn't this be kind of a confusing signal? It seems to me that God has a very high regard for Abraham. He has a very close relationship with Abraham, and God says, what I'm about to do is too big of an event. I need to tell Abraham about this. I think that's a pretty remarkable thing that God says. And in verse 19, I have chosen him so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. Abraham was chosen by God because he was a man of great faith, but now God adds in another reason he chose Abraham. Because I know that Abraham is the type of man who will teach his descendants to follow me. He will teach them about righteousness and justice. A lesson in both righteousness and justice is going to be given when we turn the page. Abraham's the kind of man who will be a strong leader of his family. And God says, that's one reason why I chose him. So, God tells him, this is what's going to happen. In chapter 18 and verse 20 and 21, I will go down and see if they have done according to its outcry which has come to me. And if not, then I will know. God already knows what's happening in Sodom. He doesn't really have to go down there and see for himself. He already knows what's happening. But he's telling Abraham, the time for judgment has come on all these cities. So now Abraham will intercede for Sodom in response. As Joe said, Abraham has a nephew there that he's worried about. He wants Lot to be okay. But might there also be some righteous people in the cities scattered throughout the plain that Abraham knows, or at least hopes are there? And so Abraham asks this question in verse 23. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Now, we're not going to read the next several verses, but Abraham begins to plead with God. Suppose that there's 50 people that are righteous. Well, would you destroy the city if I could find 50 people there? And God says, no, I won't do that. Well, what if it was 5 less than that? What if it was 45 righteous people? Would you spare the city for 45? Yes. Well, what about 40 and 30 and 20 and 10? And Abraham whittles it all the way down to 10 people. God, if I could just find 10 people, would you spare the city? And God says, yes, I will. Now, when we turn the page, we see that God doesn't spare the city. What does that tell us? There wasn't even 10 people there. Not even 10 in this large, developed city. God said if there was, he wouldn't destroy it. So there must not have been. But Abraham asks a question in verse 25 that I think is an important principle for us. He says at the end of verse 25, shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly or deal righteously? In other words, God, won't you do the right thing? I know you. He asks it as a question, but he's saying it as, I know that you will do the right thing. You're the judge of all the earth. Your ways are right. You will do the right thing, whatever you decide. And do you notice how Abraham speaks to God? How would you characterize his back and forth with God in this passage? I'm sorry? Very careful. God, if I may, pardon me just a moment. Could we maybe talk about this a little bit? And let's see. What about 50 people? Sure, I won't destroy it for 50 people. Okay, great. I'm so glad to hear that. God, let me ask you something else. What if it was just 5 less than that? And Abraham has this very hesitant, very reluctant kind of approach when he's talking to God. And I think that says something about how Abraham views the character and the greatness of God. All right. We've already seen Abraham as a man of tremendous wealth and abundance. We've seen him in chapter 14 as a man of great strength and ability and military power. Now we see Abraham as this man of great tenderness who is begging God to spare a wicked people. So we're learning more about this character, Abraham. He's very impressive. All right, now chapter 19. Chapter 19, I want you to notice the chronology of this. There are some expressions in chapter 19 that help us see how quickly these events took place. So in chapter 19 and verse 1, you see this expression, in the evening. All right, so in the evening, 2 angels came to Sodom as Lot was sitting in the gate. Okay, so back in chapter 18 and verse 16, the 3 men get up, they start walking towards Sodom. It seems that 2 of them, the angels, continue on, 19 verse 1. Abraham and the Lord stay back and talk things through a little bit. So now chapter 19 and verse 1, these 2 angels come into the city of Sodom in the evening. Now, where does it say Lot was? Sitting in the gate of Sodom. We don't talk like that. What does that mean? Okay, Jerry says the city gate was, I'm going to add some words, okay, but this was a very prominent place in the city, a very popular, highly trafficked area. It's the gate of the city, the entrance to the city, and that's where a lot of business was conducted. That's where a lot of cases were heard and determined. Thane, what did you say earlier? Okay, yeah, this is kind of like where the city council might be. So we would think of this as maybe City Hall in our day. Okay, there's a lot of activity there. There's legal proceedings that are going on. There's lots of people who are there carrying out their business. So think about where Lot has been. Chapter 13, verse 12, when they separate from, when Abram and Lot separate, Lot, well, he moves his tents over toward Sodom. Okay? Then in chapter 14 and verse 12, it says that he was living in Sodom. And now, chapter 19 and verse 1, he's sitting in the gate. He is in the place where the business of the city happens. Lot seems to be very entrenched in the city of Sodom now. Okay? All right, Joe? Yeah, go ahead and elaborate your point.
Just say in verse 9, later on, it says the men of the city, when they're surrounding the house, says, this one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we would little worse with you than with them. So it appears that he's maybe not well accepted either.
Okay, all right. Okay, good. Now, these angels come and Lot offers them hospitality. What does he tell them to do? Come into my house. Why? Because you don't want to be outside. You don't want to be out in the city. Why not? You're about to find out. Come into my house. You notice both chapters, 18 and 19, begin with a story about hospitality.
I always think it's strange that we think of angels as being female. They're always male.
Oh, that's interesting. Always? Are you sure? I'm not. I don't know. I've never thought about that before. That's an interesting point. Oftentimes we think about angels as cute little naked babies with wings. Yeah. But he was an angel, right? Right? At least they're depicted. He's got the little halo over and he's shooting people. Yeah. So many times, and to Judy's point, I'm going to have to do a little research on the male-female thing. I can't think of any female angels right off the top of my head. You may be right about that. I can, of course, think of several male angels. Usually in the Bible, when angels come along, they're delivering a message, or, like in this case, they're coming to do some damage. Okay? Wayne?
I'm having a thought here about Lot and Abraham. You think about the love that God has for us and the way He shows it to us, even though many times we're not the way He would want us to be. We see both Lot and Abraham, in this case, trying to protect the people that are about them with that same kind of love that they have towards them. And maybe they are thinking they haven't had an opportunity yet to do what should be done or whatever. But I see love expressed by both Abraham and Lot. And I think maybe the same kind of love that God has for us.
And I think it's because that's what God's people do. Because we're taught by Him to do that, as John said. Yeah, it's a good point. All right. When Lot welcomes them into his house, I'd never noticed this before. Verse 4, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. Now, there's another translation, the ESV. Anybody got the ESV? Somebody has it. Dad, would you read the end of verse 4, that last expression?
All the people to the last man surrounded the house
all the people to the very last man surrounded the house. Okay. That seems to be more than just, well, a lot of people came to Lot's house, this general kind of a statement. Down to the very last man, it says. How many people did Abraham need to save the city? Just 10. Maybe this helps us understand what's going on. No, there's not even 10 there. Down to the very last one, they surrounded the house. Oh boy. All right. So they demand that Lot bring these two visitors out so that they can sexually assault them. And Lot begs them not to do this. And what does he do instead as an alternative? Lot, what are you doing? Guys, I read so much about this. Why did he offer up his daughters instead? And I don't have a satisfactory answer for that. Well, that's possible. That's a good point. A lot of people say, well, Lot knew what these men's intentions were, and he knew that they wouldn't accept it anyways. Yeah, okay, but what's your relationship with your daughters going to be like after that? Hey, Dad, you remember that one time you threw us in the sea with blood on our hands to the sharks? You remember that? Yeah, we were lucky they didn't eat us, but do you remember when you did that? Man, wow. I don't know what's going on here. Maybe the evil of the city has just rubbed off on him more than he realizes. I don't know, but this is just absolutely confusing behavior.
Did he know they were angels?
Did he know?
He knew they were angels, right? Lot, you think he knew they were angels? So that, I think that he felt like he had a duty, he was doing that to protect the angels.
It could be. I suppose that's a possibility. So, of course, at the same time, though, you would think, hey, you're angels. Can't you guys just, disappear? Also, there's somebody else mentioned in this story that I think we need to mention. It talks about in verse 12, 13, and 14, Lot's sons-in-law. And yet Lot, what does he say of his daughters? They have not known a man. So, what's the deal there? Well, apparently they're engaged, but they're not actually married yet. So the betrothal kind of idea, we think about that. They're going to be married soon, so these are the sons-in-law, but they've never known a man yet, so they're not actually married yet. So, yeah, Jimmy.
So, if we go back to the earlier verse, it says,
Make it quick.
Every man from the youngest to the oldest
Yes.
was there,
Right?
and clearly identifies that the sons-in-laws were not in the home. Were they outside? That part of that model?
Good question.
For another time?
I'm thinking they were in the house, Jimmy. But I may be wrong about that. Let's talk about that later, because I got to keep moving. The angels pull Lot back in the house. They strike everybody with blindness. Interesting. What happened at the Tower of Babel? God used people's mouths to confuse them and stop their sinful behavior. Here, he takes away their eyes to confuse them and stop their sinful behavior. Now, chapter 19, verse 15. As morning dawned. Now, even Lot himself seems pretty slow to grasp the seriousness of the situation. The angels say, Lot, you got to get out of here. Get your family, get out of here. Lot goes to the sons-in-law. Hey, guys, we got to get out of here. They laugh at him because they think he's kidding. They're going to find out pretty soon that he wasn't kidding. So the angels take them by the hand and escort them out of the city as morning dawned. Okay? Now, verse 23 says that the sun had risen when the judgment begins. And there's not a whole lot said about what actually takes place when the storm of fire and brimstone begins. There's only 2 verses. In chapter 19 and verse 24 and 25, only 2 verses tell what happened. That it rained fire and brimstone from the Lord out of heaven. God overthrew the cities and all the valley, all the inhabitants of the cities and everything that grew on the ground. And that's it as far as the actual destruction. Contrast that with the flood that gets multiple chapters in Genesis. But judgment came in the daylight hours. Now then, chapter 19, 27 through 29, early the next morning, Abraham goes out to the valley to investigate the devastation. This happened all in the span of 36 hours. This was really quick. Okay, I want to close with a couple of thoughts, and I'd like to say some more, but I don't have time. First, okay, I'm going to close with one thought. Think about this with me as we stop. So there are some in our nation who celebrate the very wickedness that God destroyed all of these cities for. The same evil that brought devastation upon them is the same evil that some in our nation today celebrate. Does this story make you wonder, like it does me, are there some Abrahams in this country, or maybe even in other places in the world, that are praying for our country, asking God, are there enough righteous people there for you to stay the judgment? Are there enough godly people in America that you would withhold judgment? That's something to think about. I hope there are some Abrahams, both in our nation and outside our nation, who are praying that prayer like he did. Okay, we'll finish up chapter 19 on Sunday. Thanks, everybody.